Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second part of our frameworks course, which will now be online for the rest of the semester. First, I want to start off by saying that I hope you all are doing well, that you are staying healthy and relatively sane, given these crazy times, these crazy circumstances, and the fact that we are all now cooped up at home. I am recording in my bedroom because I have 4 kids at home. And so everybody's in a different room. And so when I give these lectures and post these, you may hear some rumblings in the background. I apologize for those in advance. I'll do my best to make sure that these lectures are uninterrupted going forward. These lectures I'm going to give every week here on out, either if they're about readings or if you have an essay due, I will comment on that. I think I will deliver a separate lecture now on your personal narrative essays, which are due next week, April 8th. I am going to also put reading questions on the board, on the discussion board for you all to answer. And that way you can continue the conversation that way. And then, of course, there will also be a Zoom meeting that I will arrange at a very reasonable hour for everybody every Wednesday when we would otherwise meet. I believe I'm going to make it around 10 o'clock. I'll indicate on email. And that way, I want to do our best to try and recreate the in-class discussion format that we had. On that note, I wanted to say that I'm very sad that we no longer have our in-class discussions. I thought they were very nice. They were really interesting and sometimes boisterous and funny and always insightful. And I'm sorry that we will not be having those discussions anymore in person. But I will do my best to try and continue the conversation through our various online platforms. So let me dive into the Edward Wilson reading. Let me say just a few points of review about what we read for before the break. It's been a couple weeks now. I'm going to make just a couple points about the first part of the reading, Half Earth, chapters 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9. By the way, I took the liberty of downloading your second reading in the Wilson book and putting it on Canvas just to make things easy for everybody. I had left the book on reserve in the library, and now nobody can get to the library. So, in any case, a couple points that he makes. First of all, he points out that we are on the verge of in the midst of a sixth extinction, and this in the life of Earth, and that this is being perpetrated by humans. Geologists call this period the Anthropocene because it is dominated by human actions. And there is hardly or perhaps no single place on Earth that is completely free of human action. It bears, even the most remote place on Earth bears evidence of human action, even if these are the pollution that reaches those remote regions. He introduces us to a handy acronym to detail the greatest human threats to biodiversity. This is HIPPO, HIPPO, on page 57. It's been a few weeks for me as well, so I'm going to pull open the book and see if I can remember what these stand for. H is habitat destruction. Again, these are the major drivers of this extinction. Habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, population growth, and overhunting. And so that means that these are also the challenges that conservationists must overcome and battle against. He tells us in chapter 9, he talks about the most dangerous worldview. And this is, on page 71, he tells us this is the idea that wilderness no longer exists. he is very concerned about, he calls them Anthropocene enthusiasts, some of them who are ecologically minded, who say that wilderness no longer exists, we need to get over that, we need to move on. He thinks this is dangerous. He thinks that we must keep certain places wild. Either if they are untouched by humans, they must be left that way, and other places must be restored to a wild state, as opposed to simply accepting the dominance of human interference and all the harm that that entails, or accommodating that harm, I should say, as opposed to accommodating that harm. He critiques those who say that wilderness no longer exists by saying that they have a faulty view or faulty notion of wilderness. And his claim is that they think of wilderness as something that is utterly pristine. And that is not the case necessarily. We ended with this quote on page 77 before the break, where he tells us, wilderness means a large area within which natural processes unfold in the absence of deliberate human intervention, where life remains self-willed. And we problematize certain parts of that definition. What does it mean to be absent of deliberate human intervention? What counts as deliberate in human intervention? Where life remains self-willed, what does self-willed mean? This is all the bottom of page 77. So, his critique boils down this way. There are people out there, these Anthropocene enthusiasts, who say, look, give up on this idea of wilderness. There is no place on earth that is untouched. To which his response is, whoever said that wilderness is supposed to be, or it's supposed to have been untouched, right? Instead of thinking it that way, think of it in terms of being self-willed and absent of deliberate human intervention. Okay, so that's his main argument. I think it is a little murky still, and we can problematize that in later discussions. But let me turn to the next reading, which was for today. I had you read chapters 10, 12, 18, and 20. He opens here by saying that Anthropocene conservation, if you can call it that, is wrongly optimistic. It is born of well-intentioned ignorance. What he means by this, Anthropocene conservation, is human-centered conservation, which he immediately equates with anti-conservation. And these are forms of conservation, in his view, that overly accommodate human interests and are pretty lax in saving the wild, as he sees it. He reveals that these parties are operating on a long-standing critique of conservation science, and that is the notion that conservation gives scant attention to the welfare of people. That's on page 83. He objects rather forcefully to this critique. Conservation is very much in the interest of humans, of people who reside in or near these wilderness areas, and for a variety of reasons. He points out, on the one hand, of course, that biodiversity is in everyone's interest, most notably people who live near these sensitive areas. That's the meta response, if you will. In the short term, around page 83, 80, 45, he talks about various other efforts that conservation areas have tried to do to accommodate the economic and social interests of the people who live around these conserved areas. Employing people, for example, to work in conservation parks and the like. He tells us that conservation demands much more research. And these neo-conservationists, they would proceed without it. They think, things are moving so quickly, so rapidly that we must accommodate what we have, and we must make do with the wild spaces we have, even if they are not so wild. And he is very critical of this. He says that one of the most researched, he says this of one of the most researched areas in the United States, which is the Great Smoky Mountains. He says, even though it is so well researched, only 18,000 of 60 to 80,000 species have been identified. And that took 50,000 research hours. So just think about the amount of research hours he thinks is still in order. And this is one reason we need conservation, is in order to study these species and to know them all. That's his argument. We are dooming conservation, or we are accepting its demise without understanding fully the species that make up these places and how they interact and rely on one another and make for healthy ecosystems. But please note how much time this would take. And do we have that time, given the rapid destruction of the natural world and economic changes afoot, the speed at which capitalism moves? Let's see, what else should I tell you? He says that conservation is about a new way of looking. We must see ecosystems as a web of interconnected and independent species. This is on page 88, he makes this point. We have no idea how great is the impact when we remove one or several species from an ecosystem. He talks in terms of a precautionary principle. We can't, or we should not, dismiss conservation or change it in radical ways until we know more. But how long will that take? Where research is needed, he argues, is in understanding the ways species interact in an ecosystem. I mentioned that before. And these interactions are, for him, more complex than many people think or suppose. He suggests that scientific theory rarely matches the near bottomless complexity of the real world. That's a quote on page 102. Consider how he describes the nature of scientific research here on page 103. He says it rarely is straightforward, but often moves obliquely. Obliquely means from like side to side. I'm going to read here in the middle of page 103. Let's see. Yeah, from about a quarter of the way down. Scientific research is thereby seldom straightforward. It rarely takes major leaps straight to the top. It moves obliquely, pressing forward at angles, reformulating, twisting, filling the subject out, waiting, looking around, describing parts more exactly, describing causal lineages more firmly. Then, like a crack in the cave wall, a guiding beam of light comes through. That is the way almost all successful science is done, and it is obviously not being done enough in ecology. The data needed to advance studies of the structure and function of ecosystems do not, in most cases, exist. Let us ask of ecologists over and again, how can we understand the deep principles of sustainability of a forest or river if we still do not know even the identity of most of the insects, nematodes, and other small animals that run finely tuned engines of the energy and material cycles? Right. And so because science is unpredictable in the way that it makes advances in terms of knowledge, we must do our best to save everything in an ecosystem. We must think that nothing is expendable. We must not accept that anything can, the demise of anything. We have to understand how these parts fit together, because they do, in his view. No single phenomenon on its own elucidates what is going on in an ecosystem. Scientists need to know the greater web, and of course its component parts, how they fit into that web. So he says that there is a lot of work to be done. On page 104, he tells us that 2/3 of the species on Earth remain unknown and unnamed. These neoconservationists that he's upset about, meanwhile, they remain focused on ecosystems, but they are ignorant of the nature and meaning of biodiversity at the species level. Right? As a result, they see species as interchangeable parts, and that is the view he is absolutely against. They are not interchangeable parts. They are unique parts to their given ecosystem. And he is critical of the idea that an ecosystem is a predictable web of relationships. In reality, the relationships between species are surprising. And he gives several examples. These are on page 107. Zombie masters, slave makers, vampire hunters. I think giant killers was another one. And these are all examples of largely insects, and I believe, and their crazy relationships, sometimes very dark relationships with other living beings, sometimes very small beings like bacteria or parasites. Note the titles he chooses to use. These are pretty exciting, right? And he wants us to pay attention to. He argues that in your reading for last week, your first reading, I should say, he points out that, what is quite well known are the megafauna, the big animals and birds and fish. But what is little known are insects, and they play a key role in maintaining an ecosystem, in contributing to an ecosystem's health. And that's where he wants our attention to turn in the interest of conservation science. So, talking about slave makers, vampire hunters, I hear him trying to stoke our interest in these smaller creatures. And these are all examples of species occupying a special niche in an ecosystem, which leads him to this conclusion here on page 111. Bottom of the page. Boom. To those who think nature consists primarily of plants and large vertebrate animals, I say look about you at the little things that run the earth. I say look at those little things that run the earth. To those who believe they can fathom the working of ecosystems with mathematical models of a handful of species, I say you live in a dream world. And to those who believe that a damaged ecosystem will heal itself or can be safely restored by replacing original native species with functional alien equivalents, I say think again before you cause damage. Good. Turning now to chapters 18 to 20. He takes up the issue of wildlife restoration. It's interesting. A minute ago, I was pointing out that he's critical of this idea that certain species can be interchangeable in an ecosystem, and yet he seems open to that, or he may be open to that when it comes to wildlife restoration. In any case, that's just a problem you might want to keep your eye on. He gives a couple of examples of wildlife restoration here early in chapter 18, and particularly talks about this man who, a very wealthy man who decided to use his millions to restore the savanna of the southeastern United States, and the long-leafed pine in particular. That long-leafed pine was specially developed to be hardy in that region. It thrived in that climate, and it supported broader growth vegetation that was native to Florida and Georgia, and the animals, the unique animals that also lived in that ecosystem. So, in other words, the longleaf pine was kind of a centerpiece to the rest of the ecosystem there, the native ecosystem. He also talks about a man who spent a lot of money trying to save a park in Mozambique and the various challenges that he faced after Mozambique had had a protracted civil war. And he and Wilson thinks he was very successful in restoring this national park in Mozambique and accommodating for the needs of the local people as well. They are hardly excluded from this wilderness, but they benefit from it. That's the point. I would point out that, one thing these two examples have in common is rich people. They rely on the private munificence of wealthy entrepreneurs. Is that an accident? Is that a necessary or unavoidable feature, or likely feature, I should say, of the kind of conservation efforts that Wilson has, in mind? And that leaves us for thought. If I had you all in front of me, I would ask you this question, which is, why is it perhaps more likely that that conservation efforts are trailblazed by or led by wealthy individuals, and why is it hard to get a democratic public more in line or on board with these efforts? So, something to think about. I don't have you here to ask. I'm trying to fix my glasses. Let me see. There we go. Okay. Reflecting on these two examples of restoring wilderness in Mozambique and restoring wilderness in Georgia, he says that there is a nagging problem in biodiversity restoration which recurs, and this nagging problem is determining the baseline. We're going to see this question a lot when we get to Maris. She is quite pessimistic about this. What does that mean, determining its baseline? Well, what are we trying to restore? When we're restoring wilderness, what are we trying to restore an ecosystem to? What state? What was the baseline at which we want that ecosystem to mimic? His solution for this is on page 182. I do think it is kind of problematic in itself. And again, if I had you all here before me, we could discuss this. But he tells us in the middle of page 182, he says, what is the baseline? The baseline is this: the species composition immediately prior to the first major shift that can be ascribed to human activity on the basis of fossil and present-day evidence is the baseline tested and preferred by scientists. Okay? The species composition prior to the first major shift that can be ascribed to human activity on the basis of fossil and present-day evidence. So, a world without humans in many ways. But he's a little bit messier about this. He goes on here on page 182. For Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, the baseline is the late Pleistocene prior to invasions by Neolithic people from Western Africa. On the U.S. Gulf of Mexico coast, it would be just before either the start of the European incursion or the later clear-cutting of the longleaf pine. So in one example, the baseline is Mozambique. The baseline is prior to any human intervention, but the second is prior to the intervention of humans, which begs the question, what about the intervention of previous human populations like Native Americans? What should we make of their intervention or their interaction with the ecosystems they inhabit? To what extent did they alter them? This is something that biologists disagree on as well. He next addresses the question, how much wildlands should we preserve to reverse the extinction rate and to save the biosphere? And the short answer is the title of the book, Half the Earth. And he offers the math for this on page 186. You can see how he arrives at that number. The challenges he recognizes are that this conservation is that it is slow and it's also piecemeal. He talks about certain hotspots around the world that he would prefer, that he thinks we could gain a lot by conserving, but those hotspots also happen to be in places that are under a lot of pressure from development. In short, though, we need to devote drastically more land to conservation, and to do so, we have to recognize the cataclysmic nature of this problem. So, saving half the planet for wildlands, he sees two major criticisms or doubts that circulate, and these are common criticisms of, obstacles to conservation. One of them is overpopulation, and the other is rising consumption or overconsumption, simply put. And he's pretty optimistic that we can combat both, or that we already are, and that they will not pose as an obstacle to conservation going forward. When it comes to overpopulation, he points out that that the average fertility rate of women in many countries, developed countries, is diminishing, and we know that social and financial independence for women are responsible for this. So that's what needs to be promoted across the world. When it comes to per capita consumption, he is pretty optimistic that its ecological footprint will shrink. I'm going to call your attention to page 191. He has a quote here. Middle of the page. Let's see. Here's middle of the page. Boom. Right around there. Okay. The footprint will evolve, of consumption, that is, will evolve not to claim more and more space, as you might at first suppose, but less. The reason lies in the evolution of the free market system and the way it is increasingly shaped by high technology. The products that win competition today, and will continue to do so indefinitely, are those that cost less to manufacture and advertise, and need less frequent repair and replacement, and give highest performance with a minimum amount of energy. This is kind of a dubious statement. I think you might agree. The products that win competition today are those that cost less to manufacture and advertise. That's possibly true. Need less frequent repair and replacement, and give highest performance with a minimum amount of energy. I guess the part I'm most suspicious of is that they need less frequent repair and replacement. If there are any fiber majors among you all, you will tell me about how the quality of, fast fashion. Clothes are designed to be, bought cheap and thrown away. I've noticed that appliances, electrical appliances, household appliances, they've been diminishing in quality for a while now. I have to repair them constantly and get them replaced. Ask your parents, too. In any case, I think that's all I need to say about that. He goes on to say that extensive economic growth is being replaced by intensive economic growth, and this is going to favor biodiversity as well. And here's a page by diminishing consumption. And here's another quote, very bottom of 192, top 193. He says, extensive economic growth, which prevailed through the 20th century to the present time, is the increase of per capita income by adding more capital, more population, and more undeveloped land. Intensive economic growth is that generated by the invention of high-performance new products added to the improved design and use of existing products. And then the next paragraph, he says, a closely linked consequence of economic evolution in the 21st century is the shift in worldview from wealth based on quantity to wealth based on quality, with the latter made permanent through ecological realism. We will focus more on quality as opposed to quantity. It's what you have and how good it is as opposed to how much. Again, make of that what you will. I am a little bit dubious of that. The last thing I think I'm going to touch on here is his last discussion is about artificial intelligence. He's very bullish on that as well, in how that's going to benefit us ecologically. By artificial intelligence, he tells us in 201, this means simulating a human brain in its entirety on a computer. And why is this important for biodiversity? Well, first, it will help us understand our moral reasoning, which is a weird claim. It's on page 204. I think it has to do with his point, the question, why did we destroy biodiversity? What is it about humans that we destroyed this biodiversity around us? And he thinks that if we can understand that, then we will operate more by reason than by ignorant instinct. With artificial intelligence in hand, which will enable us to understand ourselves and our thought processes better and our moral reasoning, we can be more rational as a species instead of operating by ignorant instinct. Consider how else he sums up the beneficial aspects of technology, and this is on page 205. I should also say that another reason artificial intelligence is helpful for us, in his view, is that it is going to greatly help us understand and catalog the natural world, which is the goal of conservation. Let's see here, top of 205. The explosive growth of digital technologies by transforming every aspect of our lives and changing our self-perception has made the BNR industries, biology, nanotechnology, robotics, the spearhead of the modern economy. These three have the potential either to favor biodiversity or to destroy it. I believe they will favor it by moving the economy away from fossil fuels to energy sources that are clean and sustainable, by radically improving agriculture with new crop species and ways to grow them, and by reducing the need or even the desire for distant travel. So the economy, these technologies, biology, nanotechnology, robotics, are going to move the economy away from fossil fuels to clean energy. They are going to radically improve agriculture with new crop species and ways to grow them. He talks about vertical farming at one point, which does not require any soil and very little water and targeted nutrients. And this, of course, is going to help us save more land, conserve more land, and by reducing the need or even the desire for distant travel. That is weird, and that comes out of nowhere. And again, I'd love to ask you what you think he means by that. Travel, of course, is a problem because it has a huge carbon footprint. Just take a look at what environmentalists are saying about this coronavirus shutdown, how the air quality is improving without all these cars and airplanes flying all over the place. But technology is going to reduce the need or desire for distant travel. What, are we just going to visit Venice online, I guess? Any case, again, something else for you to think about. And there we go. That's all I have to say about this lecture for today. So this went a little bit longer than usual. I'm going to try and tighten these up going forward. I like to stick it around 20 minutes. But, this was an experiment, or experimental, I should say, in nature. And if there are any problems with it or any issues, I'd like to hear from you. I need to know how to do this right. You can help me. Let's see. And I guess this also went long because I had to give you those introductory remarks at the beginning, but we can speed past that in the future. Okay? Talk to you next time.